Chair recognizes Professor Blakey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next witness, the one dissenting member of the autopsy panel, Dr. Cyril Wecht, received an MD degree from the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine in 1956 and an LLB from the University of Maryland School of Law in 1962 and a JD from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law in 1962. Dr. Wecht currently serves as coroner of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. He holds numerous editorial positions on the board of medical and legal publications, and he has written on a wide variety of medical and legal subjects, and in particular, the assassination of President Kennedy. It would be appropriate at this time, Mr. Chairman, to call Dr. Wecht.
Committee calls Dr. Wecht.
Dr. Wecht is a very outspoken critic of the Warren Commission findings, and he dissents from the single bullet theory very strongly. He also apparently has some feelings that the missing brain of President Kennedy, that there may have been some conspiracy to do away with it, or that it may still exist. We'll hear from him about all of this. He's just been sworn, and he is now seated and ready to be questioned.
Chair recognizes Staff Counsel Andrew Purdy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Wecht, did you request to testify today?
Yes, I did.
Dr. Wecht, what are the major conclusions of the forensic pathology panel with which you are in disagreement?
The major disagreement is the single bullet theory, which I deem to be the very essence of the Warren Commission report's conclusions and all the other corroborating panels and groups since that time. It is the sine qua non of the Warren Commission report's conclusions vis-a-vis a sole assassin. Without the single bullet theory, there cannot be one assassin, whether it was Oswald or anybody else. I am in disagreement with various other conclusions of the panel. I am most unhappy, have been extremely dismayed by their failure to insist upon the performance of appropriate experiments, which I believe could have been undertaken with a reasonable degree of expenditure of time, energy, and money to once and for all show whether a bullet, 6.5 millimeter copper-jacketed lead-core piece of military-type ammunition could indeed strike a rib and a radius in a human being and emerge in the condition which Commission Exhibit 399 is today. I am extremely unhappy about the fact that a more intensive effort was not made to locate the missing pieces of very important medical evidence in this case, which I pointed out back in the summer of 1972. Not that I was the first to learn of this, but amazingly, nobody had made that public disclosure prior to that time. I have raised some questions concerning the head wound and the possibility, albeit remote, of a second shot fired in synchronized fashion from the right side or the lower right rear, synchronized with the headshot that struck the president in the back of the head. And this is related to a couple pieces of evidence, and again emphasizes the necessity of having the brain to examine. These are the major areas. There are, of course, numerous facets of all of these disagreements that relate to the so-called single bullet theory.
Dr. Wecht, is it your opinion that no bullet could have caused all of the wounds to President Kennedy and Governor Connally, or that CE 399 could not have caused all of the wounds to both men?
Based upon the findings in this case, it is my opinion that no bullet could have caused all these wounds. Not only 399, but no other bullet that we know about, or any fragments of a bullet that we know about in this case.
Dr. Wecht, at this time I would ask you to examine what has been entered into evidence as JFK exhibit number F95, which is the bullet CE 399. I would also like to ask that exhibits F102A through D, which are photographic enlargements of this bullet, be entered into evidence at this time.
Without objection, they may be entered into the record this time.
Dr. Wecht, what is the basis for your opinion that CE 399 could not have caused all of the wounds to President Kennedy and Governor Connally?
It is a composite based upon several things. The timing of the Zapruder film which we know runs at 18.3 frames or individual units of the film strip per second. The evaluation of the wounds in the President and Governor Conley. The timing of the test firing in the hands of the most skilled marksman that the government could find in 1964 of this Mannlicher Carcano weapon, the bolt-action non-automatic World War II Italian carbine, a grossly inferior weapon. The very vivid testimony of Governor John Conley, about which he has been completely consistent for the past 14 years concerning the fact that he was struck by a different bullet. The vertical and horizontal trajectories that must be attributed to Commission Exhibit 399 if the single bullet theory is to be substantiated. These are the various factors that relate to the single bullet theory.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask at this time that the item marked JFK Exhibit number F-294 be entered into the record.
Without objection, it may be entered into the record.
Dr. Wecht, is it correct that you asked to use this particular exhibit in your presentation today?
Yes, I did. I submitted slides. These are blow-ups of those slides.
Could you please explain why you feel this exhibit supports your contention that CE 399 could not have caused all of the wounds to both men?
Do you wish me to walk over there, Mr. Purdy?
Yes, if you care to, Dr. Wecht.
Commission Exhibit 399 in the upper left photo is demonstrated with a side view. It shows the copper jacket to be completely intact, unscathed, with no deformity, mutilation, or markings. This is another side view. The small defect at the tip is where a piece of metal was properly taken by the FBI for spectrographic analysis. The photograph on the bottom right shows the nose, the penetrating portion of the missile, which is completely unmarked and without any scathing at all. The photograph on the lower left shows the base of the bullet, which is the only area of deformity, what I would refer to as some flattening with indentation of the metallic rim and focal extrusion of the inner lead core. That is the only deformity. Now, I should like to move over to the next exhibit.
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, Dr. Wecht, if we could let the record show that Dr. Wecht is referring to JFK Exhibit number F-294 now.
Thank you. I do not see... I beg your pardon. Yes, I'm sorry, F-294. The one which I was referring to a moment ago was F-102. I forgot to look at the bottom. This exhibit, F-294, is a composite photo that I believe clearly, dramatically, and most succinctly demonstrates the absurdity, the scientific untenability of the single bullet theory. This is Commission Exhibit 399. I will not engage in semantical quibbling with my friend and colleague, Dr. Brodden, whether you can be near pristine or fully pristine. It is a near pristine bullet, again, with the only deformity being demonstrated at the base, as we saw on F-102. Commission Exhibit 572 represents two bullets of identical ammunition to 399, 6.5 millimeter copper-jacketed lead-core military-type ammunition that were fired under the auspices of the Warren Commission, I believe at the Edgewood Arsenal sometime in 1964. These two bullets in CE 572 were fired into cotton wadding, striking nothing, coming to rest in that soft material. Please note that at the base of those two bullets, one sees, in my opinion, even more extrusion and deformity of the lead core than one sees in 399 from the impact of the firing mechanism. Commission Exhibit 853 represents a bullet that was fired through the carcass of a goat that broke one rib of a goat, a smaller bone than that of a gentleman, Governor Conley's size, 6'4". I want to emphasize this because I realize that this learned body has studied these, but many people miss the fact that it is substantially different. They think maybe it is a visual distortion. The reason that this bullet looks bigger is because it is flattened. not only is there significant extrusion at the base, but this apparently larger bullet is due to its flattening. A bullet that broke one rib in a goat carcass. And Commission Exhibit 856 represents a bullet that went through the wrist of a human cadaver, breaking the distal end of the radius. I would like to emphasize that these are not my selections. They are bullets that were selected by the Warren Commission. I can only assume that for their purposes, since the single bullet theory was their creation, that they chose the bullets that they felt would be best for their vested interest. I now come back to Commission Exhibit 399, and I ask anybody, forensic pathologist, ballistics expert, criminal attorney, investigator, to look at 399, which under the single bullet theory is alleged to have broken both a rib and the radius, and contrast it with the bullet that was fired through the carcass of a goat, breaking only a rib, or the bullet that was fired through the wrist of a human cadaver, breaking only a radius. This is the dramatic evidence that was produced, developed under the auspices of the Warren Commission. And it is this kind of evidence that I wanted to have reproduced by other experiments. And I strongly disagree with the statement that has been made by my colleague, Dr. Baden. One, that perhaps it couldn't be done, it might be too much trouble, and so on. I don't know how much he emphasized that today. That was discussed in the past with members of the staff and in our group. And what he did discuss today, that this could not be simulated. I take strong exception to this. We're in now 1978 with technological advancements and greater armamentarium. They could be interestingly simulated in 1964. I have great wonderment as to what the problem is 14 years later.
So, Dr. Wecht, it is your opinion that were tests to be conducted to simulate these wounds, that such tests could be done sufficiently similar to the wounds in question to have an accurate illustration?
Let me point out that these tests that I am referring to have been performed, in fact, by a pathologist, Professor John Nichols, University of Kansas School of Medicine, a full-time academician, who shot them through ribs and wrists. I know Dr. Nichols, he's not an independently wealthy man. He was able to do this. He was able to get the materials. He was able to set up the experiments and follow through. Why our panel of distinguished experts with all our expertise and this staff representing a very prominent committee, which in turn represents the House of Representatives of the United States Congress, why such tests could not be performed? I feel constrained to say that they were not performed because people knew full well what the results would be. And I also want to take strong exception with the statement that if one were to shoot through bones that are not innervated and vascularized as they are in living human beings, one cannot be sure that one is getting similar reactions. Here we are not talking about what the president's body would have done with the head wound. We're not talking about that. We're talking only about whether a bullet, as several members of the House Committee have questioned Dr. Baden, we're talking about what the condition of the bullet would be if it went through these bones. There's no problem in setting up that experiment.
Dr. Wecht, is it your opinion then that not only is the conclusion of the forensic pathology panel that CE 399 is consistent with having caused all the wounds, not only do you feel it's inconsistent, but you feel it's demonstrably false. Is that correct?
It is absolutely false I got involved back in 1965 with the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Let's say for 12, 13 years, I have repeatedly, and limiting it to the context of this forensic pathology, numerous times implored, beseeched, urged in writing, orally, privately, collectively, my colleagues to come up with one bullet that has done this. I'm not talking about 50% of the time plus 5% or 1%. One bullet that will have done this. I also heard reference today by Dr. Baden that yes, we have seen bullets not in a military setting, but we've seen them in civilian life. I can only say to you, as a member of the panel, that at no time did any of my colleagues ever bring in a bullet from a documented case of the Commonwealth of such and such, or the state of such and such, versus Jones or Smith, and say, hey, here's a bullet in a documented case, here's the crime lab's report, it broke 2 bones in some human being, and look at its condition, it is pristine. I stand here today, and I wonder where that bullet is. Maybe it'll be presented by the next member of the majority, who has been conveniently sandwiched on the other side of me sometime tomorrow.
Dr. Wecht, what is the basis for your opinion that the positions of President Kennedy and Governor Connally in the limousine are inconsistent with a single bullet passing through both men?
The physical...
I think you might want to stay up there. We'll get to the exhibits in 1 second.
The physical relationship of the 2 men clearly demonstrates the physical impossibility of the trajectory attributed to Commission Exhibit 399, specifically the horizontal and vertical angles with which they would have had to have struck the President and Governor Connally. Absolutely impossible.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I would ask at this time that exhibits marked JFK exhibit numbers 229, 272, and 244 be placed up on the board and admitted into evidence.
Without objection, they may be entered into the record at this point.
Dr. Wecht, what point along the film do you feel corresponds with the time when President Kennedy and Governor Connally were supposed to have been hit according to the single bullet theory?
Commission Exhibit the exhibit of this panel, of this committee, F-229, which is a blow-up of Zapruder frame 193, demonstrates the President and Governor Connally just before they go in behind the Stemmons Freeway sign. Both gentlemen are turned to the right, facing the crowd, and their right arms are extended in a wave of greeting or recognition. This exhibit F-272 is a blow-up of Zapruder frame 222 and shows Governor John Connally after emergence from the Stemmons Freeway sign. And F-244, which is a blow-up of Zapruder frame 225, shows the President and Governor John Connally. In my opinion, Zapruder frame 193 clearly demonstrates that neither gentleman had been shot. F-272.
Dr. Wecht, if I might ask you, based on F-229, what is the basis for your opinion that neither man has been struck by a bullet in that photograph?
There is absolutely no external physical manifestation, no reaction of any kind on their part of a voluntary or involuntary nature, which would even suggest that they have been struck by a missile.
Dr. Wecht, is it possible that either or both men have been struck by bullets but are not yet manifesting a reaction?
In my opinion, without any question, no.
Referring to F-272, which corresponds with Zapruder frame 222, is it your opinion that Governor Connally is indicating a reaction to being struck in that photograph?
No, absolutely not.
Referring to F-244, is there any indication on that photograph that either or both men have been struck by a bullet?
Yes, President John F. Kennedy has definitely been struck, as seen on F-244, Zapruder frame 225. Governor John Connally, in my opinion, has not been struck in that frame, as of that frame.
Referring again to F-244, what is the earliest prior to that point that President Kennedy would have to have been struck?
I would say probably somewhere I would put it based upon the timing of the Zapruder film and counting the frames. I'd put it back somewhere about a half a second, maybe even a little bit more, somewhere along there. I cannot be precise. I do want to point out at this time, if I may, because there's some confusion on this, sometimes some deliberate misrepresentation of the period of time during which the two gentlemen are behind the Stemmons Freeway sign. That is a period of 0.9 seconds. I emphasize that because we see in F-229 that indeed Governor John Connally is sitting directly in front of the President. We see in F-244 that Governor John Connally is still seated directly in front of the President. when we bring up the question of the trajectory that hopefully we'll get into later, they say, but we cannot know what happened when they were behind the Stemmons Freeway sign. I just think it is important for the record to reflect the fact that what presumably they are asking us to just speculate upon is that in that 0.9 second interval, the president bent down to tie his shoelace, to fix his sock, he was shot, and he sat back up. I do not mean to be flip. This is a very serious matter, but I would suggest that is a movement that the most skilled athlete, knowing what he was going to do, could not perform in that period of time. That is very important to understand, because we see their positions before, immediately after, and I think it is pure poppycock. It would be an insult to this committee for anybody to suggest that we can't really determine trajectory because we don't know what the physical relationship was between the two men when the president was shot, and when they say, under the single bullet theory, John Connally had also been shot.
Dr. Wecht, what was the nature of the wounds through President Kennedy that indicates to you that he would have reacted as quickly as you indicated to being struck?
Well, he was struck in the back. There are a variety of nerves that innervate the skin, the musculature, blood vessels, and so on. He, as indeed Governor John Connally, were both healthy adult males in a very vibrant, dynamic, sensitive situation, attuned very much to their environment, and there's no question in my mind that the reaction would have occurred immediately, in an infinitesimal moment.
Okay, Dr. Wecht, you've already gone into somewhat the issue of trajectory and articulated on the photograph, to some extent, why you believe the president and the governor were not lined up such that a bullet could have passed between them. How certain are you that they could not have been lined up behind the sign when they are out of the view of the camera?
I am absolutely certain, for the reasons that I have already given and as are demonstrated on these films. There is simply no way in the world that the kind of changes of positions of these two men could have been accomplished. There's no physiological way in which it could have been performed. There is no basis to speculate on why such a movement would have occurred. Quite literally, John Connally would have had to have moved a foot or more to his left and then moved back. And or the president would have had to have almost leaned out of the car and then to have come back to his position. And I'm not being the least bit facetious. That is what would have had to have occurred in that 0.9 of a second interval, if we are to assume that this bullet went through the two men in the fashion attributed to it in the single bullet theory.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to ask at this time that the two items marked JFK exhibits numbers F-320 and F-273 be entered into the record.
Without objection, they may be entered into the record.
Ms. Godfrey, if we could, we'll keep those photographs up also. Dr. Wecht, is it correct that you asked that these two diagrams be used during this questioning?
Yes, I did. One...
Dr. Wecht? Excuse me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me.
For the purposes of the formulation of these diagrams, how was it determined where the men were seated in the car and the angle the bullet would have struck President Kennedy on?
The positions of the two men were formulated in this schematic representation based upon my review of the Zapruder film, originally at Life magazine headquarters in 1966, at the National Archives in 1972, and repeated under the auspices of this forensic pathology panel last year and this year. It's also based upon my review of the Nixon Muchmore films, my review of the testimony and the accounts of numerous people involved, including Governor and Mrs. Connally, and Mrs. Kennedy, and other eyewitnesses. All of these things together, plus the discussion that we have just been through, would indicate to me that this is a fair and most reasonably accurate representation of the positions of the Kennedys, the Connollys, and the two Secret Service agents, Greer and Kellerman, who were sitting in the front seat.
Dr. Wecht, what is it about the normal paths of bullets which leads you to the conclusion that these diagrams illustrating the photograph permit you to conclude that the bullet did not pass through both men?
The inescapable fact that unless a bullet, especially one fired from a high-speed weapon, reasonably high speed, approximately 2,000 feet per second muzzle velocity, unless it strikes something of firm substance, such as bone or something else, that bullet will travel in a straight line.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask at this time that the item marked JFK exhibit number F-245, which is a blow-up of frame 230 of the Zapruder film, be entered into the record.
Without objection, it may be entered into the record.
Dr. Wecht, in your opinion, could Governor Connolly have incurred the damage to his wrist, which is described in the medical reports, and still be holding the hat as shown in this photograph?
No, absolutely not. In F-245, which is a blow-up of the Zapruder frame 230, we are told, under the single bullet theory, that Governor John Connolly, for a period of approximately 1.5 seconds, has already been shot through the right chest with the right lung pierced and collapsed, through the right wrist with the distal end of the radius comminuted, and the radial nerve partially severed. I heard some vague reference to a nerve, but I didn't hear the follow-through that I was waiting for about nerve damage. There was nerve damage, yes, to the radial nerve. And the thumb, which holds this large Texas white Stetson that is required for it to be in apposition with the index and middle fingers to hold that hat is still being held, and Governor John Connolly is not reacting. This is, again, a very alert individual under a particular circumstance, and I do not believe or accept for one moment the story, the fiction that we must accept under single bullet theory that this gentleman, at this point, 1.5 seconds previously, has been shot through his chest, through his wrist, and into his left thigh.
Dr. Wecht, is it your opinion, based on this exhibit, JFK exhibit F-245, that Governor Connolly has not been injured in any way?
Yes, that is my opinion.
Dr. Wecht, is it possible that he has been injured prior to this frame but has not yet manifested a reaction?
No, I do not believe so, not given the nature and extent of his wounds. The multiplicity and the areas damaged, I do not believe that.
Dr. Wecht, given the nature of his wounds, how much prior to the time that he is struck is the earliest he would manifest a reaction?
Well, a fraction of a second. Again, an infinitesimal moment. It is possible that for a fraction of a second he could have been shot, although I do not believe that. Please keep in mind that now we must correlate that with the governor's own version. And remembering that this bullet was traveling 2,000 feet per second muzzle velocity, much faster than the speed of sound, please keep in mind that it does not seem at all likely. I doubt that it is possible that he had already been struck.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask at this time that items marked JFK exhibit numbers F-246 and F-247, which correspond to the Zapruder frame numbers 236 and 237, be entered into the record.
Without objection, they may be entered into the record.
A number of
Dr. Wecht,
frames.
from your examination of these photographs, do you conclude that Governor Connolly has been struck?
Yes, I believe F-246, which is a blow-up of Zapruder frame 237, demonstrates that Governor John Connolly has now been struck.
Dr. Wecht, what about his actions leads you to the conclusion that he has been struck?
The body is turning, the cheeks are puffing out, there is a noticeable grimace on his face, much in contrast, for instance, to F-245, Z frame 230, and there seems to be some dishevelment of the hair. This can be seen very dramatically also one frame later, F-247, or Zapruder frame 238, which I remind you is 1/18 of a second interval away, and you can see the hair movement, the twisting of the body. There's no question in my mind that the governor has now been hit.
Dr. Wecht?
There's a live forum on with a vote immediately following, and at this time the committee will recess for 15 minutes.
The committee has come back, beginning
Dr.
questioning
Wecht, referring again to the
here's committee counsel questioning Dr.
exhibits
Wecht.
F-229, F-272, and F-244, which are the frame immediately before and the frames after the sign. You discussed the fact that the men did not line up in a horizontal trajectory. Could you articulate why, in your opinion, they do not line up in the vertical trajectory?
Yes. The panel, the last of my recollection, was in unanimous agreement that there was a slightly upward trajectory of the bullet through President John F. Kennedy. That is to say, that the bullet wound of entrance on the president's back lined up with the bullet wound of exit in the front of the president's neck, drawing a straight line, showed that vertically the bullet had moved slightly upward. Slightly, but upward. That is extremely important for two reasons. One, under the single bullet theory, and Oswald is the sole assassin, or anybody else, in the sixth-floor window, southeast corner of the Texas School Book Depository building, you got the bullet coming down at a downward angle of around 20, 25 degrees, something like that, maybe a little bit less. It had originally been postulated, I think, by the autopsy team and initial investigators at considerably more. How in the world can a bullet be fired from the sixth-floor window, strike the president in the back, and yet have a slightly upward direction? There's nothing there to cause it to change its course. And then, with the slightly upward direction outside the president's neck, that bullet then embarks upon a roller coaster ride with a major dip, because it then proceeds under the single bullet theory through Governor John Connally at a 25-degree angle of declination. To my knowledge, there has never been any disagreement among the proponents and defenders of the Warren Commission report or the critics about the angle of declination in John Connally, maybe a degree or two. So we've got that bullet going through the governor at about 25 degrees downward. How does a bullet that is moving slightly upward in the president proceed then to move downward 25 degrees in John Connally? This is what I cannot understand. My colleagues on the panel, they are aware of this. We discussed it, and what we keep coming back to is, well, we don't know how the two men were seated in relationship to each other. I don't care what happened behind the Simmons Freeway sign. There is no way in the world that they can put that together. And likewise, on the horizontal plane, the bullet, please keep in mind, entered in the president's right back. I agree. Exited in the anterior midline of the president's neck. I agree. And was moving then, by definition, by known facts, by a straight line from entrance to exit, from right to left. And so with that bullet moving in a leftward fashion, it now somehow makes an acute angular turn, comes back almost 2 feet, stops, makes a second turn, and slams into Governor John Connally behind the right armpit, as it is referred to medically, the right posterior axillary area. The vertical and horizontal trajectories of this bullet, 399, under the single bullet theory, are absolutely unfathomable, indefensible, incredible.
Dr. Wecht, I'd like you to examine JFK exhibit number 84, which has already been entered into the record, which is an x-ray of Governor Connally's chest, of his wrist. And Dr. Wecht, could you tell us whether you believe that CE 399 could have caused the injuries to the wrist of Governor Connally?
No, I do not. I would like to emphasize that this is what is referred to medically as a comminuted fracture. I have been negatively impressed by repeated efforts on the part of my fellow panelists and others to minimize the nature, the severity of this fracture. It's almost as if it just is a slight, linear, non-displaced fracture. It is a comminuted fracture with substantial displacement. Also, and comminuted means fragmented. Also, again, despite the testimony of my colleague, my predecessor here today, I must take strong exception. He has indicated that the radius apparently is just not that big a bone. As this distinguished committee and members of the staff saw yesterday, Governor John Connally, I think, is about 6'4". I don't know his exact weight, 200 pounds to give or take. He's a big man. This is the distal end of the radius, where you can see the bone begins to fan out. It indeed is a heavy bone. To dismiss it as if it were a phalanx, a finger bone in a 10-year-old child, is not fair. It is not an accurate representation. I say that a bullet that struck that wrist bone, the radius above the 8 small wrist bones, it's one of the 2 large bones coming down from the elbow to the wrist, that a bullet that struck and caused that damage, and which had previously damaged and destroyed, pulverized 5 inches of the right fifth rib, could not have emerged in the near pristine condition of Commission Exhibit 399. And that relationship, I also want to point out that I heard testimony here today, as I had heard discussed previously in our panel, about, well, we don't really know if the right fifth rib was damaged and how much, and if it was struck directly, it might have been by implosion or whatever. I don't know where this speculation comes from. I know indeed what the operating surgeon on Friday, November 22nd, 1953 at Parkland Hospital said about what he found when he explored Governor John Connolly's chest. He found 5 inches of that bone literally pulverized.
Dr. Wecht, is it your opinion that CE 399 could not have caused the wounds other than the wrist of Governor Connolly? I take it from what you've just stated about the rib, the damage to the rib, that you do not believe that CE 399 could have caused the damage to Governor Connolly's rib. Is that correct?
Let me make sure I understand your question, Mr. Purdy. Are you asking me, could 399 have caused the damage to the rib alone, if one were to assume that it struck no other bone?
Correct.
That is a possibility that I would accept, that I cannot rule out.
Dr. Wecht,
that if it struck the rib alone.
Dr. Wecht, is it possible that CE 399 could have caused all of the wounds of Governor Connolly other than the wrist?
WSCR
a fragment or a portion of the bullet to the left thigh? Yes, that is another possibility that I cannot exclude.
Dr. Wecht, if you want to be seated again?
Yes.
Dr. Wecht, earlier today, Dr. Baden testified on behalf of the forensic pathology panel that the wound in Governor Connolly's back was such to leave the majority of the panel to conclude that the bullet which struck him had struck something else first. Do you agree with that interpretation?
No, I do not feel that there is any definitive evidence, although it is a possibility that the bullet might have struck a small branch, some leaves coming in. I cannot rule that out, but I think that the fact that the scar on Governor John Connolly's back is in a horizontal plane is more consistent with the shot having been fired from the right side, the right rear, entering with some degree of a tangential nature, some tangential nature.
Dr. Wecht, you stated earlier that you have a disagreement with the certainty of the forensic pathology panel's conclusion that the president was struck in the head with only one bullet. If the president was struck by a second bullet in the head, how close in time to the first bullet do you think the other one came?
If the president had been struck in the head with a second bullet, then it would have been fired in synchronized fashion, simultaneous with the shot that did strike him in the rear of the head, as has been presented here today.
Dr. Wecht, what evidence is there which supports the possibility that there was a shot from the side or from the lower right rear?
Very meager, and the possibility based upon the existing evidence is extremely remote. There is a small piece of some material that is present at the base of the external scalp, just above the hairline, which has never been commented on before except by me following the 72 investigation of the materials of the archives and commented upon by this forensic pathology panel. There is a total deformation of the right side of the cranial vault with extensive fractures of the calvarium, the top portion of the skull, and extensive scalp lacerations and loss of soft tissue, so that we cannot know exactly where the exit wound was. It is therefore possible that that extensive deformity of scalp, underlying galea, underlying bone, calvarium, could also be the locus of a second shot of some kind of frangible ammunition which would not have penetrated deeply or at all through the calvarium. I want to emphasize that this is remote but I have pointed this out because it is a possibility. The question of the president's movement after he was struck in the head makes us direct our attention toward such a possibility. And, of course, the absence of the brain and the failure of the original pathologist to have conducted what is routine, what is perfunctory in any kind of an autopsy where the brain has been fixed in formalin, to serially section the brain 10 to 14 days later, and the absence of the brain and the inability or the failure of the staff to obtain that medical evidence, all of these things, I believe, make it important to just raise that possibility, remote as it may be, that a second shot might have struck the president in the head in synchronized or simultaneous fashion.
Dr. Wecht, to what extent would having access to the brain itself enable a firm determination as to whether or not the remote possibility of a shot from the side is supported or refuted by the evidence?
Well, examination of the brain would help a great deal. Of course, if the bullet had not penetrated through the calvarium, then there would be no evidence of a second bullet track in the soft brain tissue. If it had penetrated partly or even a fragment or two, then certainly at that time, and even today, if the brain had been properly preserved and fixed and the formalin solution changed and so on, one would be able, I believe, to tell whether there is only one bullet track. That is, from the right upper occipital region down to the lower right temporoparietal area. The brain would be extremely important to help us determine whether more than one missile had penetrated, or a fragment of a second missile might have penetrated the brain, along with the one that we do know definitely penetrated. And I'm in agreement with that description that was presented today regarding that shot through the head.
Dr. Wecht, does the present state of available evidence permit the conclusion that to a reasonable degree of medical certainty there was not a shot from the side which struck the president?
Yes, with reasonable medical certainty, I would have to say that the evidence is not there. I've already said it's a remote possibility, and I certainly cannot equate that with reasonable medical certainty.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions.
All right. This time, the committee will operate under the 5-minute rule. Withdraw that, then. Chair will recognize Counsel Garrett Cornwall.
First, so that we might understand the reasons for the disagreement as to principally the single bullet theory between you and the rest of the medical panel, let me ask you whether you have had access to any data or information that the rest of the medical panel members have not had access to.
The only thing that I am personally knowledgeable of was the frame-by-frame study in blown-up fashion of what I was informed then was the primary copy of the Zapruder film on huge lighted tables at Life magazine headquarters in 1966. Aside from that, I do not know of anything that I have seen that they have not seen.
And would you feel that your expertise in the field of forensic pathology differed in a substantial way from the expertise of the other panel members in that field?
Professional scientific expertise related to formal training in forensic pathology, practice in the field of forensic pathology in a medical legal investigative facility, I would say that I am not aware of any major or substantial differences.
Then it would be fair to state that the difference of opinion between you and the other panel members, as again to principally the single bullet theory, is based strictly or derived strictly from a difference of opinion based on the same evidence from persons of similar backgrounds and training.
Yes, clearly, Mr. Cornwell, it is a difference of opinion. However, I should like to supplement that answer by saying that I believe this is not in the realm of interpretive or speculative or conjectural opinion, but is related to things which I truly believe do not even require the expertise of a forensic pathologist to see and interpret.
Just so we understand for sure what your testimony is as to the possibility of a headshot from the right, you have called it something like the slimmest possibility, the
Remote, I would
remote possibility. In a court of law, what would be the normal role of opinion to only that degree of certainty?
Well, you are more of an expert than I, Mr. Cornwell. However, I won't take the easy way out and evade your question in that fashion. I'm sure that every judge I've been involved with would not permit such testimony to go in. But, of course, there are other differences, too, as you know, that work the other way, involving the fact that this is not a court of law.
Okay, so just again to understand that part of your testimony, would it be fairly accurate to state that what you have suggested basically is that this is not a normal case, and that therefore it's sort of because it was the president who was killed, that we'd like to know as much as absolutely possible, and if we'd have had more data such as the brain, we might have even been able to do away with all speculation on the subject. Is that correct?
I'm not sure if I completely follow you. Let me say, and please stop me if I'm not being responsive, that had I been involved in the original investigation, then I certainly would have done those things that I've talked about, the examination of the brain in its fixed formalin state approximately 2 weeks afterwards, which incidentally they started to do on December 6, 1963, but which they then aborted. The last sentence of that supplemental report is something like, no sagittal sections of the brain are made in order to preserve the specimen, quote unquote. Were this case brought to me in consultation as a medical legal expert, not involving the president, but just somebody who was able to retain an independent forensic pathologist, I indeed would raise these same points to the attorney, whichever side, the district attorney or the defense attorney, and ask them to look into it. You see, what I would be permitted to testify in subsequently at a trial would be one thing, but that I would raise these things investigatively in advance of the trial, it would make no difference were it the president, you, me, Mr. Jones, or Mrs. Smith.
Directing your attention next to the single bullet theory, as I understand your testimony, it's not that one bullet of a manless or Carcano type would not have been powerful enough to go through the neck, the chest, the wrist, and embed itself in the thigh. Is that correct? As a matter of mere power.
Yes, I believe that it is possible for that kind of ammunition to go through those several portions of a human anatomy.
And if the single bullet theory is not correct, how many bullets, in your view, did strike the two occupants of the car?
Well, of course, let me answer that. I believe that the president was struck definitely twice, one bullet entering in the back, one bullet entering in the back of the head. I believe that Governor John Connally was struck by a bullet, and I believe that another bullet completely missed the car. I think that there were 4 shots most probably fired. I eagerly await with extreme anticipation the results of the consulting firm that I understand your committee has retained in Boston, both Baranak and Newman, concerning their interpretive studies of that motorcycle policeman's tape from that day as to whether or not they have definitely found evidence of 4 shots having been fired. But I think your question was how many struck the occupants, and I think that there is definite evidence for 3. Possibility of more, but I can't really introduce evidence that would corroborate that. More than 3.
If I could direct your attention again to, I believe it was Exhibit 294, which showed deformations on various bullets, and simultaneously I'd like to ask if we could show the witness 399, the actual bullet. Have you had a chance to look at the exhibit?
Yes, sir.
The question I'd like to direct your attention to is, under what circumstances does deformation of a bullet occur?
I feel that when a bullet strikes a dense object, such as a distal end of a radius in an adult male like John Conley, that there would be deformation of a measurable degree.
Then, using the example of the wrist you just used, would it be accurate to state that such a bullet perhaps could have gone through the neck without experiencing substantial deformation if it went through the neck of the president alone? In other words, that's not where you would expect substantial deformation.
Yes, that's correct. So there would not have been deformation of a substantial degree. As a matter of fact, based upon the description which we have by documented record and testimony of the physicians who examined the president at Parkland Hospital Emergency Room, the small, even-edged, round, symmetrical wound that they thought at that time mistakenly was an entrance wound, I would say that the bullet was not deformed, it was not wobbling or tumbling, and it had not straightened out from a wobbling course only to start wobbling again.
All right. And let's again use the hypothetical of just going to the governor's chest. Could it have gone through the chest alone, nothing else, and suffered no more deformation, in your opinion, than 399?
You mean after emerging from the president's neck?
Well, either way, or both, whichever. If the hypothetical varies, tell me both ways.
Well, I do not believe that it could have gone through Governor Conley's chest because the the horizontal and the vertical trajectories would not have permitted the course of that bullet.
No, I'm not talking about trajectories. I'm just talking about if a bullet went through the chest alone.
In a hypothetical situation.
Yes, sir.
Doing what we believe the bullet did in President Kennedy's upper chest and neck area, and then doing what we know the bullet to have done in Governor Conley's chest. Is that your question?
Well, let's just assume the trajectories lined up for purposes of the discussion.
The answer is, and it gets back to what Mr. Purdy asked me, the answer is I think that it would be possible for a bullet to have emerged with a relatively minimal degree of deformity, having gone through those two parts of the human anatomy of two human beings.
All right. And then let's skip the wrist for a moment. Could it have also embedded itself to the degree that it did in Governor Connolly's thigh, or that some bullet apparently did, and suffered no great deformity in that process?
Yes, that would be possible.
All right. So it's the wrist and it's primarily the problem.
Well, when you put the wrist on top, it's a cumulative thing, yes, because the rib cannot be totally ignored in a cumulative sense with the wrist.
But
it is rib and wrist together. Rib alone, I recognize the possibility of a bullet doing that damage and emerging in this condition.
All right. Let me then rephrase it. It's the wrist which is primarily the problem. That's the one that you would expect the greatest deformation to occur in.
Yes, especially with rib and wrist. Wrist alone, as I've already said, I believe would have produced more deformation than we see here, had those injuries been noted that we had demonstrated on the blow-up of Governor John Conley's wrist x-ray a moment ago. I just want to say that the rib then followed by the wrist would place greater physical stress on the bullet than wrist alone.
Even though the two of them were probably separated by some air between the two. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, it's an additive effect.
All right. Now, it then simply boils down to, as I understand it, the proposition that 399 could not have gone through the wrist and remained in that good of condition.
Well, I don't know what you mean by simply, because I'm also including, if you're limiting it to that, the answer is yes.
All right.
But my criticism of the single bullet theory includes much more than just deformation.
May I ask the clerk to hand me the exhibit 399? 399, the one the witness has. It's apparently our exhibit 95, is that correct? What I would like to do now is discuss with you the implications, if any, of velocity on these hypotheticals we've just been discussing. The markings on the bullet, of course, are of critical importance. Is that correct?
Yes.
They have been observed by you very carefully on prior occasions and on this occasion.
Are you referring to the piece taken for spectrographic analysis and the deformation at the base?
The bullet.
Yes.
All right. If I were to hold the bullet up above the table and tell you I was going to drop it, would it worry you that we might destroy some of the evidence by covering over some of the markings on the end of the bullet?
No, unless when we're talking about the possibility of doing some very refined ballistics studies.
Nothing observable.
No, I do not believe with the naked eye.
No damage will occur.
No.
What would you estimate the velocity of that to have been?
Well, a free-falling object, if I remember my high school physics, is about 32 feet per second. Is that right, gravity?
I'm not the expert. I don't know.
I'm a little bit removed from my physics, but I think that rings a bell. 32 feet per second. Yeah.
Would it be accurate to state that, at least in relation to the velocity of a Mannlicher Carcano at the muzzle, that was virtually zero velocity that we just observed? Very, very.
Yes, in relationship to 2,000 feet per second, just a fraction thereof.
Now, if we were to increase that by dropping it higher and higher, or using some other method, such as perhaps embedding it in a piece of wood and hitting it, at what velocity would that bullet begin to deform if the thing it struck was a bone of the nature of the governor's wrist?
I cannot be certain about what the minimal velocity would be that would be required. And I'd like to suggest that this question and many others like it, which might be extremely relevant, because this question could have been easily answered, Mr. Cornwell, by simply shooting 6.5 millimeter ammunition to another Mannlicher Carcano weapon instead of, engaging in cross-examination of me, although I realize you're free to do that. But this is the kind of study, sir, with all due respect, that could have been performed. And if it has been performed, I, as a member of the panel, have not been made aware of it.
Would you know whether or not it would be possible to calculate the velocity at which the bullet would begin to deform upon striking a bone such as that?
One could probably work out some experiments that would permit some reasonable conclusions in that regard. I would have to confer with experts in physics, experts in ballistics, before expressing a definitive opinion that would get certainly beyond my limited realm, relatively speaking, of forensic pathology.
All right. Would it also be possible to determine at what velocity a bullet like that would shatter bone?
Again, I believe offhand that such an experiment could probably be worked out within a reasonable range.
Now, let's suppose we determined those two matters. The point at which this bullet hitting straight on, and then perhaps it was going sideways, began to deform upon hitting bone, the velocities there. And we also determined the velocities at which bone shatters. And let's just suppose hypothetically those two were not the same, and that the bullet deformed at a higher velocity than bone shattered. Would there not then be a gap between the two at which the bullet could go through bone, shatter it, and suffer no deformation?
I can't answer such a hypothetical. It really involves too much speculation. I really can't respond to that intelligently.
All right, well, let's see how far, though, what you could provide us as an insight on this problem. Let me ask you, would you at least know from your experience that it is a relevant factor how fast the bullet is going when it strikes bone in order to determine the amount of deformation that would occur, if any?
To some degree, it is a relevant factor with regard to the extent and severity of such deformation.
Now then, returning to the exhibit 294, you didn't tell us, I believe, when you explained the deformations there, how fast those bullets were going. Would you mind doing that?
To my knowledge, those bullets were fired from another identical weapon, a Mannlicher Carcano. The ammunition was identical to Commission Exhibit 399. To my knowledge, the test, which was set up by the Warren Commission, fired that directly through a goat carcass, so that the velocity was roughly equivalent to the muzzle velocity, and similarly with the wrist of the human cadaver.
All right. Do you have any information as to how fast the bullet was traveling, whatever bullet it was, when it hit Governor Connolly in the wrist?
No, there are estimates. My recollection is that it's been estimated that when it struck his chest, it was probably down to about maybe 1,800 feet per second or thereabout, and the wrist maybe as little as 1,200 to 1,500, something like that, but that's a vague recollection.
And what are those estimates based upon? What assumptions would necessarily underlie them?
I think that they were based upon some studies that the people involved in this field had performed.
Well, what I meant was, are they based on assumptions that the bullet hit nothing first and that it was going through the air from its muzzle, and the muzzle was located no more or less than certain distances from the governor, things like that?
Well, no. The estimate of the velocity in the governor's chest was, of course, predicated upon their belief that the bullet had already gone through President Kennedy's back.
As you can hear, the House Select Committee on Assassinations is continuing its questioning of Dr. Wecht, who is the sole dissenting member of the forensic pathologist panel that was retained by this committee. But because of previous programming commitments, we have to leave these hearings at this time. We will return tomorrow morning for live coverage of hearings before the House Select Committee on Assassinations at 9:06 Eastern Time. Once again, we'll be here at 9:06 Eastern Time.